Okay. Shanisha and Natasha, you guys get to come on up here. Hi there. So we have a crowded room, and hopefully everyone is enjoying some pizza here. Uh, keep eating the pizza. We have a lot of pizza. So the more people eat, the less I have to actually deal with after the event. So take some home, maybe. But I'm really glad you're all here. And again, I want to repeat what I said at the start of today. Um, this is only possible when we have all of the faculty and staff who are supporting us here, and of course, when we have students who actually share their work. And so I've really enjoyed what little I've been able to hear about, because I've been running around, but I've heard wonderful things so far about how the panels have gone, and I know that I feel the kind of really positive energy. So now we're ready to move on. We're going to have our keynote speech, but I'm going to let Shanisha Shelter, I'm going to let Shai introduce the speaker. Thank you very much. And I again want to really emphasize Shai and Natasha have been important helpers for today, so I also want to thank them specifically for making this happen. Yeah, okay, you got it. Much better than me.
If you've been here since the first session, welcome back. If you just got here, welcome. Good job to the students who've already shared their work, and we look forward to hearing more student research as the day continues. For our keynote speech during the lunch session, we have Mayor Lee Kinnamon this afternoon. Mr. Kinnamon has had a long career teaching in the humanities before turning to politics. He's also been deeply involved in preserving local history here in Americus. We welcome him to share his experiences with us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. And it is a pleasure to be here. A somewhat daunting task to deal with this topic. I thought, well, surely I can fill some time talking about the humanities. I've spent the better part of my life engaged in teaching in the humanities, so I should be able to talk about it. But then when you begin to ask the questions that undoubtedly the keynote address should answer at a symposium of this nature, it becomes a bit more daunting. So I have on the screen the focus, I suppose, the humanities, why bother? And increasingly in our contemporary world, people are asking the question not in a rhetorical way, but in a rather serious way. Why bother with that? At the end of my teaching career, we began to see the emergence of what is referred to as STEM curriculum. There are scientists in here, and so I hope I don't step on your toes when I talk about this. But science, technology, engineering, and math. And somewhat belatedly, the gurus of curriculum at the state level, and nationally actually, began to insert, and I would argue somewhat artificially, the letter A into that acronym. And it stands for, of course, arts, and I think by extension, humanities. So I felt at the end of my career as though I had to justify what I was doing, what I was teaching, the value of what I was teaching, because I was in that area of teaching that's the other stuff, all that other stuff. And it had the label of being often referred to as soft skills. How many of you who teach in the humanities have been told that your subject matter is soft skill? Well, I think that is rather pejorative. Personally, I took exception to that, and I hope that maybe I can prove that case, although this is not an academic paper being delivered, so my professorial friends, you can put your pens up. I'm not going to give you the opportunity to rate me on on this. I don't know that everybody will agree with the things that I'm about to present. I come from another era, and I did not teach in the academy, as it were. I was not a college professor. I taught at high school. And so, when you attend college, graduate from college in 1987, which I did, you can imagine the education I had, and especially when you find out where I had it. It's somewhat dated by today's standards, or is it? Maybe is the question. Just as I've asked the question, the humanities, why bother? Well, a liberal arts education of that era, is it still relevant, or am I a dinosaur, somewhat partially educated and ill fit for the contemporary world? Well, there are people who probably think I am ill fit for the contemporary world, and that's okay. But I think that what we offer in the liberal arts and the humanities in particular, and within the Western canon, which I'm not going to defend specifically, but I will do so somewhat indirectly, I believe it still is valid. And I think that those of us who've committed our lives to teaching in those areas owe it to ourselves to think about these questions and not just read about them in the Chronicle or something like that, right? That we really need to engage our brains in thinking about what it is we do and why we do it, whatever the discipline happens to be. So I hope to maybe do that today. The other thing is that I do have deep roots in Americus, and as you'll see, that there is all of this sort of adds up to who I am. And I will say this, the other theme, I think, of my talk is that will emerge unintentionally, I suppose, is that place matters. Increasingly, we're finding that people in America, elsewhere, are beginning to understand that place matters, that we can't abstract ourselves from our particular locations. Abstractions, I was told, where I went to school, are a dangerous thing, that we are to prefer, especially in our writing, English professors, the concrete to the abstract, right? That the danger of abstraction is that it is a reductionism, that we reduce things and complex things into simplistic terms and thereby lose meaning by reducing them to mere abstraction. And so I think that's true with ourselves. We cannot remove ourselves from the context of place. Historians know that, of course. Place matters. So I think that might be a theme that comes out as we talk. Where did I get my interest in the humanities? When I thought about this, I had to go to these two people. One I knew directly, intimately, and one I knew only through history and through the written record. The man on the left is my mother's father, my grandfather, who came here in 1912. He was born in Spring Valley, Virginia, a place I just visited, in fact, last week. I was up there. The family has been on that land in Virginia for 200 plus years. And in Spring Valley, he was born in 1883. He attended Emory and Henry College. They were devout Methodists. And he attended Emory and Henry, and he was a classics major, a subject that is not taught here. I don't know if it was ever taught here. I'm sure it must have been in the Dark Ages, but classics is a subject that has kind of gone by the board, and we're going to talk about that just in a minute. But he was a well-educated man. He went on briefly to edit a newspaper. He then took a degree in theology at Vanderbilt. He was thinking he was going to be an ordained Methodist minister. He came further south into the deep south, and he got sort of diverted into teaching. There was a classics Latin job, as it would have been at the high school level in Marshallville, Macon County. And he stopped there, was waylaid there to teach classics, to teach Latin. And that would have been in 1911. And he stayed there just a year, and then a job opened here in Americus, at Americus High School, to teach Latin. And he made his way here and never returned except to visit to Spring Valley. He went on to do postgraduate work at the University of Chicago in languages, which, as you know, still to this day has a very fine program in classics. He was fluent in Portuguese and Spanish. He taught French. He was a polyglot. He was a master of languages, Romance languages primarily, although he tutored a man who came here, Mr. Hermann Stein, who is a German who came here and didn't speak any English, and my grandfather tutored him in English. And my grandmother said that Herman would arrive at the front door and practice his English with her and bow to her very politely and say, "Good evening, Mrs. Hale. Good evening." And he would work on his pronunciation. And finally, Herman Stein became very fluent in English and was a successful business person in Americus, Georgia. That was my grandfather. He died tragically in 1936. My mother was 3 years old. I never knew him. We do have an extensive collection in the family papers of letters, correspondence, all sorts of his newspaper articles. He wrote a weekly editorial, a newspaper column for the local paper. So we have a fairly extensive written record. So I feel as though I know him. And those of you who teach history know what I mean when you feel like you know somebody because you've read so much of what they wrote, their written words. So you kind of know him. Now, the woman on the right, my grandmother, Laura Ansley Hale, she was from an old, very much rooted Sumter County family. They were very privileged people. She attended Wesleyan College in Macon, Georgia, as did her mother and her grandmother. All family, women in the family back into the 19th century attended Wesleyan Female College. She was a very good artist. But as women of her generation often did, she painted, she learned how to do this, became rather expert, got married, and what happened? Quit painting, right? She gave it up. And her paintings were squirreled away in what we call the packing closet on the back porch at the house I live in, my grandparents' house on West Church Street. And I rescued them as a young, meddlesome, rummaging kid in that house in the summer times. I would rummage and I found things. And so I found her beautiful watercolor paintings and rescued them. And she said, "Oh, quit going in there and rummaging and getting those old things out. They're not worth anything." Well, they're beautiful. She had quite a skill. But women of her era, she was born in 1894. When they were educated in those arts, this is sort of the transition, really, I think, between, in the South in particular, between the cult of domesticity and how it drove women's education. And Susan, you chime in. And the new woman. So my grandmother and her mother before her were somewhat examples of the new woman, but in other ways not. My son happens to be writing a paper about that right now for his thesis at Mercer. He is finishing his degree in history and political science at Mercer, and his thesis is about women's clubs in Americus at that time, and women like my grandmother and her mother, and the roles they played. So I grew up knowing a great deal about my family's history from people who had the great privilege of being well educated. I was read to as a child when I came here. I would get up in the bed with my grandmother and she would read to me from, we read a lot of Dickens. She came from that generation with a deep appreciation, that had a deep appreciation for Charles Dickens. So we read Little Dorrit, and we read David Copperfield, and we read on, A Tale of Two Cities, and so forth and so on. So I got pretty well versed in Charles Dickens. But educated in other ways, in local history, in obviously family history, but in local history And of course, a lot of this was through the lens of the lost cause. My grandmother, although she was progressive in some ways, was certainly an exponent of that era of the lost cause and had come up in it. After all, she was born in 1894. Her grandfather was a wounded, near mortally wounded Confederate officer, and so she was, as we might say, ed up with the lost cause mythology. So now, at that age, when I was a child hanging out in Americus, I didn't have any understanding of what that meant, what the lost cause was, or mythology of the lost cause. I was, one time, I remember one summer, Miss Juanita Brightwell had called. She was a librarian at the Carnegie Library on Jackson Street. And she called my grandmother and said, "You need to send young Lee around." I was 10 years old, if 10. "And you need to send him around. We're going to show a movie upstairs in the auditorium, Birth of a Nation." So I was dispatched around to the Carnegie Library to watch D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. Now, you can imagine a 9, 10-year-old boy looking at that movie. And what I thought, of course, I was interested in all the horses and the soldiers and, the flags flying and the cannons blasting and all of that. It's a spectacle. But I had no idea what I was looking at. I was completely uninformed about that. And my grandmother's interpretation, of course, is not how we look at that movie today. And so it was that I came up with an education in some ways and a miseducation in other ways. So when I asked the question, the humanities, why bother? Well, that's beginning to get at the root. Why I bothered had to do first with the influence of my grandparents and my parents as well, but I just picked my grandparents, in terms of shaping my interest in literature, in art, in history. They were musicians as well. My grandmother was a fine pianist. My mother was a fine pianist. So I grew up in a musical household. My mother would deposit us in the bathtub, my sister and I, and we would be in the bathtub shriveled up like prunes while my mother played Chopin and Rachmaninoff. She had studied piano and was a very good pianist. And so I was serenaded with Chopin and Rachmaninoff while I was in the bathtub shriveled up like a prune. But it gave me a great appreciation for music. And I went on to study music, one of the things that I did. There's the house on Church Street as it was around 1915 when it was constructed, and there it is later years. And then it's me on the front porch of my grandmother's house. I couldn't really do this presentation without having that connection because that's a profound influence on me. For better or for worse, in some ways, of course, worse had it not been examined through my own personal education, had I not examined the things I'd been taught in that house, but certainly for better in many ways as well. And going back to the idea of music and how I wound up in the liberal arts and studying in the humanities, when I was in high school, I thought, and most people around me thought, my parents thought, that I was going to a conservatory to study music. I had done that. I had been studying music since I was in the middle grades or earlier. I studied music theory and composition. I played in orchestra and symphonic band. I was just completely obsessed with music, and took theory and composition lessons, went to governor's honors in music theory and composition in 1982. This was in 1983, the year I graduated from high school. I had been admitted to a conservatory and was destined to go, I thought, and then had a change of heart. In the spring of my senior year, I began to question whether or not a life in a practice room, a life as a musician, was really for me. And I read the curriculum very carefully at the New England Conservatory, and it was very narrow. In fact, to take courses in history or political science or religion or philosophy or English literature, you had to kind of make special arrangements because it was very much a vocational type education, except it was music, very narrow. And I began to question whether or not I really wanted to pursue that narrow education for 4 years. It began to weigh on me, and ultimately I decided not to go in the 11th hour. And wound up at another place. I wound up at the University of the South. Some people will answer that question about the humanities this way. They will quote Socrates, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And I suppose at the time I made that decision to bail on music school and to go to another university, I was maybe thinking in that way, although I don't know that I would have articulated it quite that way. But I knew that there were questions in my mind that were pressing on me that had not yet been answered. There were ideas that I had encountered in advanced English in particular. Who are my English professors in here? English professors. Well, I will tell you this, that my senior English professor, the advanced placement professor, teacher at the high school where I went, had a profound influence on me. It was in her class that I first encountered Lear. And not too many senior English teachers these days teach Lear. I think that's something that they think is for people who are of older age to understand. But if you know the play, it addresses so many questions of the human condition, not just aging, but so many issues. What is love, right? That's one of the most profound issues addressed in Lear is what is love? What does it mean to love someone? And these questions excited me. I can't tell you how much that English class affected my life. Frances Paget was her name. She had a degree from Georgia College and State University. Then it was Georgia Women's College, right, in Milledgeville. And then she went to the University of Michigan and had her master's in English and theater, a double master's from the University of Michigan. She was well educated, and we acted out Lear. When we did Lear, we were acting out scenes, and it had a profound effect on me. Cannot underestimate that effect. So I realized that narrowness of music education, a conservatory, was not for me. And I think maybe this was in my mind. I don't know. I think perhaps. On the other hand, the examined life sucks too. And those of you who have spent your lives studying the complex issues like what is love, you know that it can also kind of backfire on you. And it can make you question and create in you a sort of dis-ease, I would argue. The humanities as a vehicle for giving you a happy life, not so sure about that. I don't want you to think that I'm depressed or anything, but I can't say that through my study of the humanities I found bliss and happiness. An enriched understanding of the human condition? Yes. Bliss? Maybe not so much. Because, an unexamined life may not be worth living, but examining mine is exhausting. And I think that when you begin to take an honest look at the human condition, and especially your particular human condition, it can be rather exhausting. It can be rather exhausting. So, again, those people who argue that, if you pursue a degree in the humanities, your life will be blissful, it will be happy, not so sure that's an argument those of us in the field need to be to be making. I think those claims are not exactly substantiated by the facts. So I did wind up at a very good liberal arts college, the University of the South in Swanee, Tennessee. It sits on the Cumberland Plateau. It was founded in 1857. It was refounded after the Civil War by ex-Confederates who were trying to find a way to educate their sons of privilege in a southern university without having to send them to Ivy Leagues in the north. Swanee was a place that received substantial assistance from the Church of England and from Oxford. In fact, the first library at Swanee was donated by Oxford University. The bishops of the southern diocese of the Episcopal Church still govern the University of the South. It's governed by the Episcopal Church. So it is a church school. It is a school where a course in religion is required, or at least it was when I was there. The University of the South sits on now 13,000 acres of beautiful Cumberland Plateau forest land on the bluffs of the Cumberland Plateau. You have these commanding views of the valley. It's about 50 minutes west of Chattanooga on I-24 and about an hour and a half south of Nashville. So some of you have crossed that mountain at Mont Eagle. How many of y'all have crossed the Mont Eagle, the big mountain up to, it's quite a climb. But that's where I spent my undergraduate years, and it was a rather wonderful place. It's in Arcadia, Ago. It was an Arcadian paradise of sorts, not without problems, problems that are increasingly being addressed as all universities are addressing these issues that come from their founding and their complex history, their complicated history. The University of the South that I attended was one that was steeped in the Western canon. So in the English department, there were specific requirements for majors that gave them little flexibility in terms of escaping 18th century British literature. Those were required courses. Shakespeare, required. Dante, required. These were required courses. So the idea of a more cafeteria-style plan of curriculum, which is more common today, did not exist at that time, at that school. Now, it perhaps was emerging in other places, but at that time at Swanee, we had a set curriculum. Likewise, in the general core curriculum, I've noticed now at Swanee it's not like that, but the core curriculum required Western Civ, it required philosophy, it required course in religion, it required a survey course in English literature. It required art history, music history, science, laboratory science, and mathematics. It was the traditional liberal arts core curriculum with a prescribed canon. Now, today we look at that as being very problematic because it excludes a lot of different groups of people in its content. It is seen as chauvinistic, Eurocentric, and inappropriate for the modern or contemporary world. I don't necessarily agree with that critique completely. I do believe that those pieces in the canon in both literature and history and so forth, I do believe that they are still valid, and I've got a few ideas that I'll share with you on that. But at least at that time, it was a fairly restricted curriculum. We wrote constantly. We read the works themselves. So one of the things that I noticed coming from there to a state university was that in places other than Swanee and other such schools, you tend to read more textbooks I did not, I think I can count on one hand the number of textbooks that I read at Sewanee. They were very limited application. So when I studied Western civilization, there was a textbook, but we read lots of original sources. There was a preponderance of primary source reading. And certainly in English, that's always the case. But within religion and philosophy, we didn't have philosophy textbooks, we read philosophers. We didn't have a religion textbook, we read religious thought. My concentration, my major at Sewanee was actually in the Department of Religion. It's philosophy and religion. And I did intellectual history. So my background, I had courses like one of my favorites was Hegel, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky. And so you can imagine reading those works in the original, the actual works. We read the entirety of the Brothers Karamazov, among many other things. But that book, by the way, how many of y'all have read the Brothers Karamazov? That's a very fine. Is it taught here? Do we teach that? I guess not. Is that? It's a tome. Yeah, it is truly a tome. But there are sections in the Brothers Karamazov that I would commend to anyone. English majors, non-English. I mean, it's profound writing, and even in translation, I didn't read it Russian. We had to have a foreign language at Sewanee. That was a requirement. We had to be reading proficient. So when I got there, I took a test, and I was cautioned. They said, now, you can take this placement test and do well. I did mine in French. But the problem is, if you do well, you have to have at least one course at the literature level. So they will put you in an upper level course in French literature. So as a new student, freshman. So you really have to kind of write. So I was cautioned by a senior that said, now, think about what you're doing. So I did not try necessarily my best on that placement test. I didn't try to, and not that I could anyway. I doubt that I would have rung it up such that I could have been put in an upper level French course. I had French and Latin in high school, and I opted to take French at Sewanee. But I did go through, I think I started at the intermediate level, which was a good thing. So that when I did get to the lit classes in French, I was able to handle them and get decent grades in those classes. But I wouldn't trade anything for reading Camus, for example, in French, or Charles Baudelaire in French. I mean, to read L'Invitation au Voyage en Français is a treat. It's a wonderful thing to be able to read in the actual language. And I fear that we have slipped our moorings, especially in state universities, by eliminating the rigor in the language, foreign language requirements. I know that I looked at y'all's catalog, and there's not a very strong foreign language requirement. I think you can get through with what amount of foreign language if you're majoring? 0. Well, that's very little. Yeah. I will say this to those of you who have aspirations for graduate degrees in any of these disciplines. You will have to have a foreign language to do that. Most graduate programs, I think all of them, would require some level of expertise, reading proficiency in a foreign language. So it doesn't eliminate you from pursuing graduate studies, but it does hamper it quite a bit. It's an impediment. Sewanee was a place that I stayed 3 years beyond because I became the assistant director of admission after I graduated. I couldn't leave. It was one of those places that was very difficult to leave. But they want you to leave. And this is a statement of purpose from the current propaganda at the University of the South. And I wanted to share this. The College of Arts and Sciences is committed to the development of the whole person through a liberal arts education of the highest quality. Outstanding students work closely with distinguished and diverse faculty in a demanding course of humane and scientific study that prepares them for lives of achievement and service, providing rich opportunities for leadership and intellectual and spiritual growth while grounding its community on a pledge of honor. Sewanee enables students to live with grace, integrity, and a reverent concern for the world. What a statement. I'm really proud of my alma mater with that statement. I think if it encapsulates what I would hope all schools would aspire to do. That's a wonderful aspirational statement to me, and very proud of them for having it. Wendell Berry. How many of y'all are familiar with the writer Wendell Berry? Has anybody ever heard of Wendell Berry? He's from Kentucky. He's pretty old now. He's in his 80s, mid to late 80s, I think. But Wendell Berry is an agrarian. He's an ecologist, an environmentalist, a poet, an essayist, man of letters, a novelist. He's written short stories, and he's written some remarkably good stuff. His latest book is about the issue of race in the United States and grappling with the continuing grappling with the issue of race. And it's a great read. I highly commend it. Here's what he says. The thing being made in a university is humanity. So going back to Swanee's purpose and vision, the thing being made in a university is humanity. Underlying the idea of a university, the bringing together, which is what that means, the combining into of all the disciplines, is the idea that good work and good citizenship are the inevitable byproducts of the making of a good, that is, a fully developed human being. I like this quotation. I think that is another good way of thinking about the work that we do in universities or in schools in general, education in general, that our product, the thing being made, is a human being. It's humanity in its best sense. That is certainly aspirational. Now, at Swanee, here's what we were told. Swanee is not a place where students learn how to make a good living. It is a place where students learn how to make a good life. And I remember being told that by a professor when I was first there, because people ask the question, well, what do people do when they graduate? What happens to people when they graduate? I don't think I was terribly concerned at that time about that. I was in a blessed situation where I didn't have to worry about it. But, can we really say that anymore? Can we afford in the business of teaching and learning to say that anymore? I don't think so. If you adopt that attitude with your majors, especially trying to attract them to English, or if you say, well, I'm not helping you, I'm not going to be in any way connected with your making a good living when you leave here. It's all going to be just, you're going to have a good life. Well, first of all, it's kind of hard to have a good life without a good living, or some living, some means of support. I mean, I would argue it's not real easy to do that. And the other thing, this is a sort of an elitist approach, I would argue. It implies that, well, you don't have to worry about that. We're not here to work on vocational skills or career skills. You just, you'll be fine. You'll fall into your family's business or whatever, and you'll be just fine. And Swanee of that period was kind of like that. I doubt they say this anymore, but that's a phrase that I remember very distinctly. Wendell Berry, though, goes on to say that the university and education in general has a purpose that is, what I would argue, increasingly important. The complexity of our present trouble suggests as never before that we need to change our present concept of education. Education is not properly an industry, and its proper use is not to serve industries, either by job training or by industry-subsidized research. Its proper use is to enable citizens to live lives that are economically, politically, socially, and culturally responsible. This cannot be done by gathering or accessing what we now call information, which is to say facts, without context and therefore without priority. A proper education enables young people to put their lives in order, which means knowing what things are more important than other things. It means putting first things first. Agree or disagree? I'm curious what your thoughts on that are. I'm very curious. We've got people who are students and we've got people who are professors, teachers, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Education is not an industry. It's not about an industry. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. 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 It is. Right. Yep. Yep. I agree. And others agree with you on that. In fact, there are a lot of people who say that the widening of the disparity of wealth is being exacerbated by encouraging students, particularly minority students of poverty in locations like ours, to follow purely vocational, career-oriented education. And I'm not disparaging the tech school at all, the technical college, because I think they all have their place. But I also would argue that for us to think that this type of education that I've kind of outlined is simply for the rich, I think we are doing a grave disservice to not only to those children, but to our society, because it will impoverish not only them, but it will impoverish our civilization by not bringing those voices to the table and not including them. So the one good thing about a place like Georgia Southwestern is while it is unaffordable for many, it's more affordable than other options for so many students. But more people can obtain an education here. So I think there are compelling reasons, and I agree completely with what you just said. And here is one of the statements that I live by. Just because we can does not mean we should. The humanities is all about this. That's what we talk about. Just because you can don't mean you should. Just because we can build artificial intelligence that can theoretically replace human beings does not mean we should do that. Or at least we should think about the moral and ethical implications related to AI and the common good. Because see, in the humanities, we talk about things like the common good, right? We actually discuss that. We discuss things in philosophical, religious, and ethical terms, and we're not afraid to. That's what we do. That's our, bread and butter. In science, technology, engineering, and math, you don't hear that dialogue as much. I'm not saying you don't hear it at all, because you do, but that's not their concern. They're concerned with what? Pushing the envelope. I get pushback from my brother-in-law, who is a highly esteemed marine biologist, and he's a dean at University of Delaware and all that, and I use this language, and well, that's ridiculous. Human beings are going to push the envelope. We're going to advance. We're going to seek the solutions and all. And I said, yes, we had the same ideas at Los Alamos. Teams of brilliant scientists were assembled, the largest academic think tank in the history of the world assembled during the course of World War II for the sole purpose of developing a bomb that ultimately, unleashed, could annihilate all of civilization. Just because you can, it don't mean you should. That's why we're here. We have to deal with what we should be doing. And the only way for human beings to grasp that is through the story, the narrative. We have to look at history, we have to look at literature, we have to look at philosophy, we have to look at religion and theology, we have to look at art history. We have to look at all of these interrelated disciplines to think about that question, should we? Just because we can does not mean we should. And I think that's a profoundly important aspect of what we do. Students must be challenged. Can they face texts from the greatest thinkers that force them to radically call into question their presuppositions? Can they come to terms with the antecedent conditions and circumstances they live in but didn't create? Can they confront the fact that human existence is not easily divided into good and evil, but filled with complexity, nuance, and ambiguity? This is Cornel West and Jeremy Tate. They wrote a stinging op-ed in the Washington Post when Howard University dropped classics as a major. Told you we'd get back to classics. So Cornel West took, as y'all know, he's an eminent scholar. He took great exception to this, and he said it was a shame that it was further dividing the classes, that these minority students predominantly attending this historic black university should not be denied the opportunity to experience the classics as a subject area. And he took them to task. Stinging criticism. Engaging with the classics and with our civilizational heritage is the means to finding our true voice. By that, he means African Americans. He was writing particularly for African Americans. It is how we become our full selves, spiritually free and morally great, by engaging in the classics. And he said to deny these students that was a travesty. I tend to agree with that. Now, I want to play real quickly. I don't know how we are on time, but Wendell Berry has been a topic here. We've talked about him in relation to his views on education.
Even while I dreamed, I prayed that what I saw was only fear and no foretelling. For I saw the last known landscape destroyed for the sake of the objective, the soil bulldozed, the rock blasted. Those who had wanted to go home would never get there now. I saw the forest reduced to stumps and gullies. I saw the poisoned river, the mountain cast into the valley. I came to the city that nobody recognized because it looked like every other city. Men and women and children now pursued the objective as if nobody ever had pursued it before. The once enslaved, the once oppressed were now free to sell themselves to the highest bidder and to enter the best-paying prisons in pursuit of the objective, which was the destruction of all enemies, which was the destruction of all obstacles, which was to clear the way to victory, which was to clear the way to self-creation, from which nobody who ever wanted to go home would ever get there now. For every remembered place had been displaced, every love unloved, every vow unsworn, to make way for the passage of the crowd, of the individuated, the autonomous, the self-actuated, the homeless, with their many eyes opened only toward the objective, which they did not yet perceive in the far distance, having never known where they were going, having never known where they came from.
Very fine documentary about him. That's one of his great poems. Having never known where they came from. So look and see The Portrait of Wendell Berry. I highly recommend that documentary, and I highly recommend his poetry, his fiction, his essays. He's a national treasure, in my opinion. What is he saying? Somebody help. Who are the English majors in here? Who is an English major? Do we have English majors? Are there any English majors? Yeah. And what is the objective he refers to? Keeps talking about the objective, blindly following the objective. Money, technological prowess, it's whatever the objective might be. In particular, I think he's referring to the objective which exploits people and exploits the environment with no regard to real costs, right? Wendell Berry is someone who's asking the question, should we? Is this morally and ethically correct for our society? Should we? And it is the question fundamentally that he says universities, in particular liberal arts colleges and humanities, should be asking. Should we? That is the fundamental question. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'll leave time if you have any questions for me. It's been kind of an odd journey, I think, to get to where I am today to talk about this. But these are things that are, I would say, core values for me. And as mayor, I ask that question, just because we can, should we? Is that sufficient to argue for doing anything? Just because we're able to, it does not follow logically that we should, we ought to. That is a question that requires deeper thought, more complex thought. Wendell Berry is saying we live in a world that is all about can do. Can do, will do. Just do it. Without that pause for reflection. We're all about the pause for reflection. That's who we are in the humanities. That's what we do. We pause and reflect. Questions? Anything? No questions about street paving, please. Yeah. Yeah, how did I make the leap from education to... Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose because I was so deeply rooted here, and I taught, now a couple of generations of children in the community. At the end of my career, I was teaching my former students' children. And I was pretty well connected, as much as someone who looks like me from my world can be, to minority groups in the community and those who are living in poverty here. I was fairly well connected with that because I knew the families and I was working with them, and I learned over time what it sort of means to be from this place and to be black and to be poor. And that influenced me, definitely, because when you're teaching in a place like this, you feel somewhat helpless because you're dealing with the after effects, right? You're dealing with the byproduct of a system that is systemically broken in so many different ways. And so for me to be able to see that and then be motivated to engage in political issues, I think it was a sort of natural step for me. Now, if I had moved around and taught in different places, but place matters to me. Obviously, you know that, Susan. This place matters to me. I have deep roots here. And it just seemed sort of the natural next step in a way. And a lot of people were asking me to do it. I honestly resisted, to be honest with you, because I taught 30 years and I kind of wanted to travel and retire and take the easy way out, right? We all do, ultimately. I mean, I want that bliss, that happiness. But it's hard to continue living here and completely disengage from the body politic. I mean, that's what it would ultimately have meant for me, just to sort of sit on the sidelines, and I had a hard time. I guess my son came home one day. I was sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch, sipping my coffee, and he had come home from Mercer. He had left, and I was in that chair when he left, like the week or two before, and then he came home, And I was sitting in the chairs before I decided to run, and he said, "Daddy, is that what you plan to do with the rest of your life?" I said, "You're 58 years old." I think I was 57 at the time. He said, "You're 57 years old. Is that what you're going to do with the rest of your life?" And it was a kind of gut punch, because I had to go back to, what was that high-minded message from Swanee, right? I mean, if I'm being honest to my education and my background, I would have to go back to, the purpose. Look at here. Providing rich opportunities for leadership and intellectual and spiritual growth, grounding a community on pledge of honor, enable students to live with grace, integrity, and then look at that last one, reverent concern for the world. So when you're tempted to sit on the sidelines and take the easy chair, maybe that's not what we're called to do. Maybe the happiness comes from engaging, taking what you've been given with your education. And those of you students, how many of y'all are students in here? Who's a student? Taking that education that you've been blessed with and engaging in the world and doing something purposeful with it. Maybe that's why people in the humanities can be happy, because we live with purpose. We understand what it means to have a purposeful life, from literature, from reading literature. We see characters in literature who have no purpose or who have a less than purposeful life, right? And by example, we see their unhappiness, or they have a misguided purpose. They choose purposes, as Paul Tillich would say, that are not ultimate concerns, making that which is not ultimate. But I guess that's it. I mean, was I guilted into it by myself, by my child? Yeah, probably so. Now, am I the best person for that job? Probably not. I don't know, because previous mayors have not. I think I'm the first educator in a long time. I think Dr. Mathis was one. He was way back. But in recent history in Americus, I think I'm the only person with an education background who's taught in the schools. And some would argue, well, you don't have a business background. You can't. I can look at a spreadsheet. I know what a profit and loss sheet is. I can look at that. But you don't have a business background. You don't understand business. Your degree, your education, your teaching history, what is that? How does that qualify you to be running, as mayor? Well, I know the questions to ask. Part of my education was learning what the questions are, figuring out what are the questions to ask. And I certainly go back to that statement about just because you can doesn't mean you should. And, we live by that. We question, should that have happened? Is that the right course? Why did that happen? Right? What do we learn from that? So, yeah, I think I am qualified. Any other questions?
Just to say something back to you.
Yeah.
Because, nowadays, I think the problem is when we have administrator in position or politician. The problem is they don't understand education. So it's kind of like the other side. So many of the faculty and people in academics would prefer somebody with an education background.
Yeah.
Because then they can understand, okay, it's great that you have a business side, but you should also understand the academic side. So maybe your decision would be somewhat well-rounded instead of just from a business standpoint.
Right.
And like education is really critical, because now when we try, everything is about selling it to the student. If you're getting that degree, going to get the degree, what is your job? What are you going to make when you get out with that degree? How much do you make it? That is now where we are, when we try to sell a degree.
Oh, yeah.
That's what they want us to answer that question. And then I think in terms of exposure to the humanities, you're reading, whether textbook or whether you're reading literature, philosophy, sociology, psychology, whatever it is that you're reading,
Right.
it makes you a well-rounded person. History.
Yeah.
You learn from your mistake, and that's why we still don't do it. We're not learning from it. And it makes you a much more critical thinker, which again, now education, they're trying to dumb it down so students or people in general are not using their critical thinking process.
I agree.
For all of this. And that's what makes it so when we appreciate the environment, we appreciate our decision, everything we make, we should think about what impact we have
Yep.
on society, on nature,
Yep.
Climate change, all
Right.
that. It makes you who you are, and coming from a different background like you, don't live here, but I can have appreciation because my background makes me who I am.
Yeah.
My knowledge and education.
Where do you live? I'm curious. Where?
I came from Vietnam,
Ah.
and I'm going back there for the first time in my life. I've lived here all my life. I haven't been back.
Uh,
So this is the first time. This Christmas, I'll be going back for the first time. That's like on my bucket list.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm going to see my homeland as an adult, not as a child, a
Yeah.
young child when I
Yep.
leave that country. And, always going in here for political freedom, just like now.
Right.
So I appreciate living in America because there's so much here that people take for granted.
Yes.
The democracy, your freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of
Education.
everything.
That's
Education.
right.
It might be expensive, but you can go.
Right.
If you really want to go.
That's
Us,
correct.
Not so much in other countries.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really critical that people need to think your education will impact who you marry, who you put into office, and
It affects your whole life.
it impacts everything you
Yeah.
do.
I mean, my life, I go back to those key points. Another point I didn't mention was that I had been admitted to law school as a senior in college, and I decided against going to law school. I felt, sometimes it takes thick-headed people like me a little while to figure out what I'm supposed to be doing. And I don't know that there's one thing that an individual is necessarily destined to do. I don't necessarily believe that. But I do think that we call it skill set today, makes you better equipped to deal with one profession or another. And I don't know. I figured it out finally, and I found where I really needed to be. And I love the classroom. I miss the kids. I don't miss the bureaucracy of teaching, but I do miss the students. But I found a way to partner with the school district. Mayors in the past have not really had strong relationships with the school district and the superintendents. I don't think it's much in recent years in particular. But I made it a priority when I got elected to work with our school superintendent in the local schools. And literacy, as you may know, I'm launching a huge initiative to improve literacy skills in the community. I think we all need to get behind that, whether you're at the college level or at primary grades. You need to be aware of the literacy issues in the community. Without a literate population, we're doomed. We are truly doomed. So, So anyway, yep. I mean, I'm a mayor who reads. I know we had a president who said he didn't read books, but that was a little alarming when I heard that. That was a statement that I heard, regardless how you feel about the person. But when he made the comment that, I don't really read books, I just kind of figured it out for myself. I'm like, Yeah, those of us who had educations like that, you can imagine how it was like, what do you mean you don't read books? You don't read any books? But yeah, so, I think, does it make me less decisive? Possibly, because, you're weighing all the options. That's the curse of the humanities education is, on the one hand, on the other hand, our life is spent on two hands, on the one hand and on the other hand, and other hands, So, anyway, on the one hand, on the other hand. Yeah, well, you do, and you think you do not trivialize things, and you also don't oversimplify. I think when you're reading complicated texts, it trains your mind to see the complexities of life. Right, going back to Lear, for example, it's an incredibly layered and complex, nuanced story. That's not a gloss over and see it one time, read it one time kind of story. That's a highly complex story, and so those of us who spend time dissecting those stories, we tend to filter our understanding of the world itself through that kind of lens. Right? Whether you're a historian and you're thinking in terms of historiography or whatever your discipline is, you tend to see it through, like literary criticism. You see the world through the eyes of a literary critic. And so it makes a difference. Anyway, any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all. I appreciate your patience with my rambling.